Hello and welcome to the OWASP DevSlop show. I'm Mimi and I'm joined by my lovely hosts Beck, Lily, and James. As always, pulling the puppeteer strings behind the scenes is our awesome producer Nancy. Today we have an exciting and thought-provoking session lined up for you all, so stick around for an awesome digital privacy breakdown. Before we get into it though, here's a message from our sponsors.
Datadog's cloud security platform detects threats in real time across your full stream of ingested data. You can easily get started with default detection rules that map to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and other compliance standards. For more flexibility, you can write custom rules right in the UI, no query language required. The cloud security platform also tracks your compliance posture alongside other security threats. And expert-built dashboards offer immediate visibility into threats and trends. 500 plus out-of-the-box integrations give you security insights in minutes. You can now view and correlate all your data in a unified platform that brings together DevOps and security teams. Sign up for a free trial of Datadog today and receive free swag.
In the age of ubiquitous technology and pervasive data collection, people often lament that privacy is dead. But if that's the case, then why do we keep hearing about it? We're joined by Sam and possibly Sam's cat today, the program lead at Digital Rights Watch, that's Sam, not the cat, to unpack. Welcome, Sam.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I feel like I'm going to let people down now if my cat doesn't join us. She has lots of privacy insights to share, so it would be a shame to not have her. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to get super nerdy with all of you about privacy today. Before I get any further, I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming from stolen lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, so-called Australia. And I just want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and pay my respects to elders past and present. For some more context about who I am, thank you for that introduction. So my name is Sam. I've worked across privacy and tech policy in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. And as you mentioned, I'm currently the program lead at Digital Rights Watch, where we do all kinds of work about advocating for human rights in the digital age. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, I definitely encourage anyone watching to go and check our website out or follow us on socials, because we get really stuck into all of this sort of stuff that we're going to talk about today. I've been a privacy consultant in the past, so I've helped private companies and governments alike try to embed really good privacy practices. And I've also worked in the government, so sort of, at the moment I'm doing a lot of sort of advocacy work, but I've been on the other side of the fence in government, sort of setting policy agendas and whatnot in the world of privacy. So lots of sort of diverse experiences in the privacy world, which I think is a good thing because everyone approaches it slightly differently. So today I'm super excited to dig into privacy. I know that you, the DevSlop team, focus a lot on security, and often privacy will sort of come up in those conversations. And so I'm keen to kind of flip that a bit, and we'll focus a lot on privacy and bring in security as well. Nice. And I'm really keen to have this as more of a discussion than a lecture, because I think a lot of these topics are really they lend themselves to a lot of really sort of juicy debate, and people don't agree on these things. So I'm really excited to hear from all of you as well about these issues.
Yeah, for sure.
So I've set up a little agenda for us, because I think this will help sort of frame how we approach this discussion. So, first, I really want to set the scene about, why privacy is important and why we should care about it. I think it's probably safe to say that all of you and everyone watching understands why security is really important, but sometimes privacy can kind of get a little bit lost in there. Is that a fair assumption that I'm making?
Yeah.
Oh, 100%.
Beautiful. So we'll start in, jumping right in the deep end about why privacy is an important thing to think about. And then we'll talk a little bit about the difference between privacy and security and where they work together and where they might sort of create a bit of tension or conflict. And then we'll do a little bit of privacy law 101. I don't love thinking about privacy just in a sort of compliance mentality, but I do think it is, it's the reality of the kind of work and world that we live in. So I think it's good to touch base on sort of our legal requirements as well. And then flowing on from that, we'll talk a little bit about how the concept of privacy has evolved over time, how it's sort of moved from this very individualistic thing of me and my information to more of a collective issue, which I think is a bit more exciting. Pardon? And then that flows nicely into this idea of privacy as harm reduction. And then at the end, it would be great, I think, to talk a little bit about privacy by design, which is a concept that's been around for ages, just about how to build privacy in, from the beginning, which I think lends itself nicely to align with things like, do you call it security by design? Is that a thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, beautiful. So that's our map for where we're going today. And I hope that you're all excited to dig into those topics.
I'm super excited. I'm keen to jump right in. Let's do it.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
Let's go.
Okay, so as I sort of flagged at the beginning, privacy sort of lends itself to a lot of this discussion. There's so much going on under this umbrella term of privacy. And it's really political. So, it's wrapped up in, there's obviously legal aspects, but it's also wrapped up in social norms and community expectations and sort of how we relate to each other, how we relate to the government, to private companies. It's really quite a meaty topic. Sorry, Siri keeps popping up and she's really annoying.
Speaking of privacy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, she'll project and be like, hey, stop. Don't misrepresent me.
So is privacy dead? If Siri's listening to our conversation right now, should we care? And why? Everybody's got one of these running around, right, with them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important thing, I think, to grapple with, because that idea of privacy being dead comes up a lot. It's often, you'll read in the media, someone will say privacy is dead, or even if you're talking with friends about privacy, they will be like, well, why should I care? Why should I bother? It's already that horse has bolted. They already know everything about me. It's done. It's too late. And I think that it's worth pushing back on that idea a bit, because that idea that privacy is dead and the sort of privacy nihilism. I just realized I haven't said nihilism out loud before. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah, privacy nihilism.
Nihilism.
Yeah. When you read something and then you're like, I don't know how to say that out loud.
I think we've got a couple people on the team who are fairly familiar with saying nihilism out loud. So,
but this sort of narrative that it's inevitable, that it's, something that we have to give up to be able to enjoy the benefits of modern technology, that's a deliberate narrative, right? That is something that falls under this umbrella of surveillance capitalism. If anyone's read the
Shanna Zuboff.
Yeah, the pivotal work.
Yeah.
That narrative of inevitability serves the interests of those who would like to be able to continue to have, data hungry, surveillance based practices, and to be able to profit off that. And so I think there's something really powerful in rejecting that narrative and being like, no, this actually doesn't have to be inevitable. It is possible for us to design and live with digital technologies in a way that are rights respecting and that is privacy enhancing. So to kind of roll over and be like, oh, it's dead, I think it plays into the hands of people who would benefit from it being dead.
Feels like climate nihilism is the same kind of thing. It's like if people are all, oh, well, climate change is inevitable, we can't do anything about it. So like that
exactly.
lets people, like companies that are polluting, keep doing it without
absolutely question. And the other thing that I would add as well is that, if it is dead, then we wouldn't see governments around the world continuing to, try to spy on activists who stand up to them. We wouldn't see companies continue to lobby for less privacy protecting laws. Like that, it is a threat to the status quo of a lot of powerful entities. And so if it was dead, they wouldn't be pushing back on it,
Do you think for people who maybe have sort of accepted the world as it is and they sort of want to reclaim some of their privacy, do you think that's still possible today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it's hard, right? It's complex, and it's especially on an individual level, to be able to exercise any kind of meaningful control over your personal information is really challenging, because the entire sort of structure and the underlying business models of a lot of the tools that we use day to day don't really allow for a lot of meaningful protection of our privacy on an individual level. And I think so like, I mean, if you're super nerdy and really really across like really techie, then I think it's more accessible. So perhaps this audience is a bit more like in a better place to be able to uphold their personal privacy. But as a general rule, for a lot of people, it's really challenging. But I think that just, which we'll get into in a bit, really kind of brings back why this is a political issue, and it's a collective issue, because we're all sort of in this together. And so it's I think that we need quite significant change to happen so that we are able to reclaim privacy in a more meaningful way.
One of the things that I think makes it especially inaccessible is the fact that we are, we're talking about privacy, not just of the information that we put out there about ourselves deliberately, information that we're posting about, like pictures or, what we have for breakfast or whatever, but the stuff that gets collected about us as well around the edges, like this is the type of laptop that I have, or this is my geolocation right now, that kind of thing. And I feel like that also that really contributes to making it hard to grasp, because a lot of that's being collected sort of under the hood. You don't even see it happening. All the things that we like and the things that we click on and all of that kind of stuff just getting tracked every time you open an email. Like you don't seem to be able to escape it, even if you're thinking consciously about the information that you're trying to provide.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that it's an interesting thought, because when we talk about a techie audience or people that are privacy conscious and making their own decisions about their own lives, this kind of even happened to me in uni. I never had a Facebook account or whatever, but there's this idea of manufactured consent, whereby by being in university or working for a company, you're kind of forced to use tools and platforms that you wouldn't necessarily usually use. So this idea that it's like an individual thing, and I know we're going to touch on this later, but just like, oh, well, if you don't like it, you can choose to abstain. It's like, well, actually, you can't. So it's better that we think about the way that these tools can be improved, because I can't just choose not to use some of these platforms. I'm forced to. I consent and I agree, but I'm forced to, basically.
It's also interesting that a lot of these platforms are actually communication tools that I know, especially for people with disabilities, can be quite a pivotal part of building friendships and things like that, where you may friendship may not be an accessible thing for you. So you can reach for platforms like Facebook and build community, but you don't get to choose to do that without impacting your privacy. So I think sometimes the discussions can, as someone who's tried for a really long time to stay off a lot of these platforms for similar reasons, I do acknowledge that there is a certain privilege in doing that as well.
That is such a good call. And I think that it comes up a bit, there's like quite a lot of privilege that comes out in a lot of discussions around privacy. Often talking with people, you will hear them be like, well, just what are you doing on Facebook? Get off Facebook. Like, well, sorry, George, that's how I like live in the modern world and connect with community. And, you know, it's quite a privileged place to come from to expect people to be able to just disconnect from all of these tools that have become like really vital.
Well, a lot of people's like work rosters and stuff are on Facebook, or like they're like, that's the. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, how are you supposed to get out of that?
Yeah,
I get
absolutely.
so frustrated with also people who are like, oh my god, you have like an Alexa, you have like an Apple Home or whatever, and you've got this microphone in your house, and how dare you? Because that's just really stupid. So why would you even like? You're clearly asking for it, and at the same time, lots of those things like voice assistants are just really helpful for lots of people. They're like a massive accessibility bonus. They're indispensable in a lot of ways. They allow people to do stuff that they couldn't normally do otherwise. And I feel like if you're just saying that dismissively, then you really aren't thinking about what purposes these things serve. And that really annoys me.
Yeah, I agree, Lily. I think it really does highlight that, I don't think it should be up to us as individuals to have to be constantly trying to mitigate these invasions and to be able to navigate this space that is purposely complex, which again brings us back to why I think this is a bigger sort of political issue and we need quite significant changes to happen so that people aren't put in the position where they have to make awful choices between being able to stay connected or being able to, use tools that can really enhance their well-being and the way that they live their lives and privacy. Like that's a choice that people shouldn't have to make. And I think it's really important that we continue to push back on that default kind of narrative. And I think that brings us sort of back to this idea of, why is it important? Why is privacy important? And so as we've kind of identified, like these technological tools and all of the data collection and processing that comes with them kind of touch a lot of parts of our lives, dating and health services and personal life, or accessing essential government services more and more often are online most of the time, or they try to push you online at least. So all of these things are really fundamental. And so as, more and more of our personal information is being personalization is being accumulated and processed, without our understanding in this kind of abstract, ominous way, the power imbalance between, private companies and governments and us as individuals and communities, that power imbalance grows even more skewed. And so protecting privacy, at least in my view, is one of the tools. It's not the only tool. It's not going to fix everything, but it's one of the tools that we have to be able to examine those power structures and to be able to push back on them and sort of reclaim some of that power. Which is, so, I mean, that's a big statement, but that's.
So like for a second. Sorry, Lily. Go ahead.
No. Well, I was going to say, like we're here with the OWASP group of folks, and why is this at all relevant to security folks? Like, honestly, I know a lot of folks are kind of thinking, all right, well, if stuff is secure, then that's all that really matters. And some people see security and privacy as the same thing. Like, well, all right, if I've got my database secured and it can't be downloaded and disseminated in plain text, then I've protected the privacy of my users. So is this the same thing? Is this privacy?
That is a great segue into talking about privacy and security and what's the difference. And I want to preface this with, people don't even agree what privacy means. I'm not sure if there's as much heated debate in the security world. Do people agree on what security means?
No.
There's various definitions. I'm sure is yeah.
I feel like even within security, there are different definitions of what privacy and private are, and they tend to be the ones that benefit security and securing more than actual privacy. So I think it's just as contentious.
That they're all the same thing.
So there's debate about what privacy is, and there's debate about what security is, and then there's also, when talking about the differences, that is also something that not everyone agrees on. So I'm curious to hear how all of you sort of conceptualize this. To my mind, so privacy is a bit more of an umbrella concept of rights and principles about controlling personal information. And we'll dig into some of the principles in a bit. Whereas then security is about protecting the information, which is obviously not just about personal information. You're protecting all kinds of data and assets and whatnot. But security is a really important practical component of privacy, without which privacy would kind of fall down. Like you have all kinds of, there's governance and policies and laws and things under privacy that need to be met. But if you can't secure that, pardon me, if you can't secure the information, that personal information, then you undermine privacy. So to my mind, you can't have privacy without security. But on the flip side, I do think you can have security without having privacy, which we can dig into.
One of the conversations that I get caught up in a lot with my job is what personal information means. If it's just somebody's name and email address, and okay, well, cool. We've met our GDPR obligations because we don't share people's names and phone numbers and whatever. But that's not the extent of personal information. I feel like I have this conversation at least once a week with software developers about hey, what are we actually gathering? Does metadata count as personal information? I know from particularly with your experience, Sam, talking about metadata, and because we're all Australian and have experienced the last few years in Australia where metadata is one of those words that keeps cropping up all the time, we know that it can be really powerful, or I feel like we should by now. And
I mean, if it wasn't, why would we collect it? That's the other thing. Why would we collect
Pokemon cards or whatever?
Yeah.
I think going back to something that Sam was saying, I think one of the things that's really interesting as well when you talk about private business and governance is that I've seen many instances where governance or policy doesn't necessarily benefit privacy under the guise of security. And it's those sort of to enhance security, we're going to surveil you, thus taking away your privacy. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget, is that very often one of the tools of security, and I guess ties into the idea of surveillance capitalism, is, to keep you safe and to keep you secure, we're gonna take away some of your privacy, but it's okay. You'll be more secure at the end of the day.
There's a lot of trust there.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those reasons why it's important not to conflate the two.
I feel like the pandemic really brought that one home in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Not just about checking in places, but the stuff that employers have been doing to surveil their employees while working from home, as if if they can't see you in person, you're not working.
So what's the digital version of that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess
we're going to turn your cameras on.
We also saw that in education with the proctoring and the you can't talk out loud to yourself, you can't have anyone in the room, and so you would have people and they would sort of track across the room because they're living in a shared housing, or they're living with someone else who has to occupy that space, and suddenly you have the proctor being who else is there, what's going on, show me the room. And it's calm down. I do have to share this space with other people. There's not a lot that I can do. And so it's
also
really interesting.
ableist and like privileged as
Totally.
fuck to be able to have
Yeah.
that kind of like security, or like security, assurance that you're like the only person there and you're not going to get interrupted, or you're not going to need to talk out loud while you're thinking through something, or
I remember getting into like quite a heated debate in a former workplace of mine where we had the privacy team and we had the security team, and we had a internal chat, right? And so of course there was logging happening and whatnot, which the privacy team was arguing very strongly for. And I understand like the value in having keeping logs and whatnot and being able to go back and access that. And the privacy team was like, well, this is incidental, like chit chat. It shouldn't be logged forever. This is, quite an invasive practice. Like, we're just talking about our day and our lives and whatnot.
Right.
Like, and that tension was really tricky to like come up with a compromise that sort of suited both of our approaches.
I think it's a really important point in any of these kind of discussions to acknowledge that there's good people on both sides, Like people aren't necessarily setting out to invade your privacy. They're either setting out to make the systems more secure or, I have a lot of engineering in my background, and there's a lot of logging that happens from an engineering perspective to improve reliability and quality of the platforms that we're talking about. And when you're actually building the systems that process this data, having access to the data is very useful when you're trying to reproduce problems with the system or trying to fix them. And so depending on your sort of like focus and scope of what you see this data as can really change, I think, how you think it's appropriate to handle it.
I've totally experienced that like firsthand, where talking to developers about the data that they're collecting and the way that they see it is totally different. They're not seeing it as personal data. They're seeing it as valuable troubleshooting data that's going to help customers.
It's 255 byte string. Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? And so it's like, well, actually, no, like somebody's, why do you need to log this particular field or why? And it's just like thinking about what you need, what you don't need, and only keeping things for as long as you need them. It's all very interesting stuff to think about, the perspectives of it all.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the key things that I would love for people to take away from this is like keeping in mind that there are human beings behind that personal information or personal data, depending on where you're coming from and the terminology you use. There are real people behind there and behind that information, and that when that is mishandled or if there's a data breach or whatever the case may be, that can have very real world impacts on people. And I think it's so easy to lose sight of that if you're just sort of thinking about it just as sort of innocuous data, not tied to people. So I would love for people to take that away from today and just keep in mind that they're not just users, they are also human beings behind that.
And the terminology disparity is really hard too. I know we already talked about this, that nobody has really good definitions of what any of these words mean. And for us to have like decent, robust human communication about them in an effective way to do our jobs, we need to share definitions, and that just doesn't always happen.
Absolutely. I mean, even just as you mentioned before, Lily, like in Australia, there's been quite a lot of debate about what personal information means and what it doesn't mean, and we're in the midst of quite a big privacy act, and that whole definition is coming to question. And that definition does make a difference because it is essentially like the gatekeeper for what protections that information is and isn't afforded. So if it's decided that it's not personal information, then you suddenly don't have to comply with a bunch of with the protections. But if it is personal information, you do. So that distinction is really important.
I think
I'm
one of
super
the things...
excited. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I'm super excited about the Privacy Act review. Like, it has been, 30 years?
Since it's been a long time coming. I think before we move on to talking a bit more about privacy law, I think that maybe it's worthwhile digging a little bit into how you can have security but not privacy, just like sort of demonstrate how that can happen. So I was thinking about some examples of how that might occur. And so as an example, you might have, world-class secure setup. You have locked. Am I allowed to swear? I was about to swear. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear. You lock
I think
your
I
shit
said fuck
down,
earlier. Go for it.
But even if you've got the most secure setup, but you are still collecting more information than you need, or if you are collecting it in like deceptive ways, then that's still privacy invasive. Even if that data that you hold is totally secure, in a perfect world, totally secure, it's still privacy invasive if you are collecting too much information. It's still privacy invasive if you are then using that information in ways that don't match up with what you told the person, like the reason you gave for collecting that information. Those sorts of things can happen. Those sorts of privacy invasions can happen even in a secure environment. Or, another example, if you were to sell that information to another company or share it with another company, maybe you've set up extremely robust, secure data transfers, and you're really chuffed about it, and it's again, perfect world, super secure. But that transfer, if that in and of itself can also be privacy invasive if you haven't been upfront with people about that happening, if they haven't consented to it, if you're transferring to another country, that would also be privacy invasive while maybe still being secure. And then of course, if you have a data breach, then your privacy and security are both compromised.
It's kind of like the whole thing around self-hosting data, right? Too, like, you can set up an incredibly robust transfer mechanism and storage mechanism on your end, but as soon as you are transferring that data to someone else that maybe the end user isn't aware of or isn't, personally comfortable with their information being with them, you're putting a big if on that other company storing that data in a way that is privacy respecting and processing that data in a way that is privacy respecting. And it's, like self-hosting your email. As soon as you send it to someone else, it's no longer private. Right? Like, you no longer have control over that data. And that has to be something that I think individuals are comfortable with too and informed about.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the really interesting things that I saw when I was a pen tester is that very often it was very hard to report privacy impacting issues as part of a security report, because it was that sort of, well, this isn't a security issue, it's a privacy issue. And unless you could directly link it back to either the Australian privacy principles or demonstrate that there was a security implication, like it was accessible by unauthorized people, businesses were very reluctant to have it as part of their final report, even though, as we were talking about before, security and privacy, while not the same thing, sort of go hand in hand.
I really like the tool that we have in the GDPR now for that kind of thing, to at least be able to say to people, to say to businesses, when you note privacy related concerns during a pen test, hey, this is a GDPR issue. That's actually something that affects the security of the business in the long term, because if they get fined and they have to shut down, that's an availability issue. And they care because it's a very big stick.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we are missing in Australia is that stick, really, is that it's not as the Australian Privacy Act doesn't, and our sort of setup of how we have how that's enforced is not as scary as the GDPR, which that holds a lot of weight for companies to take seriously.
In Australia, we've got like a whole exception for small businesses, right? Like if you're a small business, you don't have to comply with the Privacy Act in a lot of ways. Is that correct? Sorry, I know, Sam, you'll probably know more than this, and this is why you're here. Is that right about small businesses with the Privacy Act in Australia at the minute? They just don't have to think about it the same way?
Yeah. So this is another great segue into talking about about the legal aspects of privacy. Yes, so in Australia, we have an exception for businesses that have an annual turnover of less than 3 million, which is a lot. That's a huge gap. And so they just don't have to comply at all, which is something that's come under quite a bit of fire over the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years, however long it's been around, but especially recently, because it's really easy nowadays for a small business to get online and to get like sign up to a particular service or get a particular vendor and just get and suddenly they can collect and they can handle quite a significant amount of personal information, but they are not required to do the same level of compliance or due diligence that larger companies have to. And the rationale behind that is because they didn't want it essentially to be too much of a burden upon small businesses to have to do that. But I think that because of how technology has developed and how we interact with businesses now, especially since COVID happened, and we're constantly checking in and whatnot, that landscape has changed. I don't think it's reasonable just be like, oh, it's too hard for small businesses to be able to do that. If they're collecting and handling personal information, they should be looking after it, and it's for their own benefit as well, right? Like not just from a privacy perspective, but if they have poor security practices as well, like that can risk their business. So hopefully that will change.
The argument about it being burdensome is super interesting too, because I think that's valid. It takes a lot of resources to get it right. And if companies the size of Facebook can't get it right, how is the average small business owner supposed to do it? And I think that really speaks to the need for us to have tools and policies and frameworks and stuff that are actually accessible and manageable by people who are like just trying to run their own small business.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know that we put some of those in place, or we tried to around COVID when we had like people checking in, and before we had the QR check-in system, when you'd walk into cafes, and you still see it, like sheets of paper with like people's names and phone numbers just sitting out the front, where anyone could walk by and take a picture.
I don't know
and it's
about
just kind of like
you, Lily, but I was super chill with that.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure we were all
absolutely
super chill with that.
adored that one. Yeah. But yeah, I think that it's like, and it's the same with security, how like a lot of basic security services are just not available to small businesses, probably like mostly for pricing reasons. Like the number of small businesses that cannot afford the average pen test, for example, but still handle all of this data is staggering. And it's really disheartening to see like there is an entire market out there that's not very profitable for people to do pen tests for small businesses. And I know that the government issued a grant a little while back, I think, but it was also not very much money to actually pay most pen testing companies. And most pen testers in Australia have got more than enough work to be going on with, that why would they bother with this like low financial return work? But it's super necessary. Like small businesses are lacking the resources and to do any of this kind of stuff, right? Security or privacy, and it sucks.
I think it's a really interesting parallel between security and privacy, specifically on the small business stuff, right? Because if you think about where a lot of the discourse happens and the companies that it centers around, like I personally know people who work at Amazon, for example, who take this stuff extremely seriously, like both privacy and security, and like their whole job is about making sure that this stuff doesn't go poorly. And they've got the resources to do that. They've also got the resources to have these like comparatively large security teams internally. Also like privacy people. But then, you get companies like Facebook where it's essentially part of their profit model to take that data and sell it on. And they still have those like large security teams and large privacy teams, but it's a little bit more about like what they can get away with, if that makes sense. And so like the intent of the company and like what the company is doing, I think makes a huge difference. And then when you take that down, and this is true, I think, for security and privacy to smaller companies, and they almost don't even get an opportunity to make that choice. They're just doing what they can.
I think one of the things that's really interesting is for a bit of context, like my house runs on what could be considered a small business network, and it has small business.
It's
Beck
not
is not
big city.
exaggerating.
You have a domain
I
controller. So.
self-own.
Yeah, like we do. We have domain controllers. We have a lot of this stuff set up, and with that comes the need for us to secure that. And it is very, very hard to get any sort of licensing for a lot of software for one or two people. Like, either because the entry level is so high in that you need seats for 20 plus people, or the base level of pricing is just incredible. Like, and no sole trader, no small incorporation, no co-op, no non-for-profit would be able to afford some of these products. And like, for us, buying these tools is a privilege and a luxury. But for these businesses, it's an absolute necessity. And it's like, if we can't afford it, they definitely can't, even though they need it even more.
You're also lucky to have two pro bono in-house security specialists as well. So
exactly. And
not
like,
everyone can say that.
And one of the things that's so frustrating is that like places like Microsoft, once you get up to their enterprise like E5 licensing, have some really fantastic security tools that just work out of the box. Like, they have fantastic cloud monitoring solutions that would be perfect for these small businesses to get a good overview.
Hello, Microsoft. Would you like to sponsor our show?
Probably not after the next comment, in that they price these businesses out of accessing these features. And it's like, you have to pay to play. And it's just incredibly unbalanced, like on the needs and expectations.
Not being as bad as it is today too, because I used to do a lot of work with Microsoft stuff, and I remember that the small to medium business was actually like a really big part of a lot of their pricing back then, or the very small business. But even things like MSDN, people could get familiar with these tools enough that they could learn how to secure them. And that's what I said earlier about like business models. It's almost like the business model has shifted away from making sure those environments are safe. Almost, I'm sure there's someone from Microsoft who'll see this and be like, "How dare you? We do all this stuff." But it's, you know, I think it's a bit of a when it's profit driven like that, I think it can be very easy to frame the discussion around actually what is profitable for the company.
So this is, I think, we've highlighted a really tricky tension, right? Because I stand by what I said. Like, I do think that small businesses do need to be, handling personal information in a privacy enhancing way, but it is challenging. It's challenging from a privacy perspective and a security perspective. There have been plenty of times where I've worked with small businesses or even large companies, and even just like writing a good collection notice. So how you communicate to people about what information you're collecting and what you're going to do with it, or writing a privacy policy is hard work. It's a very complex space. It changes quite a lot. And if you are working in like a global or an international way, that becomes even more hectic because every country has its own thing going on. So it's really challenging. And one of the things I think is really interesting, as you highlighted before, James, is that like one of the features of privacy law, at least in Australia, is that it is generally principles based. So the idea being that you can, make it fit your specific context that you are working in. You can sort of scale it up or scale it down. So a lot of that work comes down to doing things like risk assessments and doing being able to understand like what information do you have, what reasonable steps you can put in place to enhance privacy and security to sort of match that scale, that sort of level that you're at. But that work in and of itself is very challenging if you don't know where to begin.
It's very contextual too. So like it almost needs people who know what you're doing very well to do it well, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's tricky because it's designed to be able to fit lots of different contexts, but that kind of can undermine it at the same time if you don't know how to do that.
I think
Right.
it's
Go
really
back.
interesting because Principal InfoSec has had a comment that I think ties in very well with this, where a lot of businesses hire security people and they're sort of expected to also know the privacy component. And the comment that Principal InfoSec made was, people ask me, a security person, about privacy, and I say I'm going to give them a 28% correct answer, then show them a diagram that was linked previously. And I think that ties in very well here, where businesses hire a security person understanding that that's also a privacy person when they're not necessarily the same thing.
No, absolutely not.
But
And I don't think that it's
okay.
reasonable to put all of it onto one person or one team. Like, they are different, and it's challenging.
So I was
and
gonna
I
be
think
glib
that, like,
and say,
oh, sorry, you go.
that's okay. I was just going to be glib and say that it's okay because in Australia we don't have a right to privacy anyway. Like, we don't have any kind of like charter of rights. That
It's in
Australian
that
citizens are
constitution I keep
guaranteed.
hearing about, Lily.
Yeah,
the
we don't have any kind
Constitution.
of Bill of Rights for Australians. So we don't have a
it's
right to
grim.
privacy, so it doesn't matter.
Oh, what a terrible... Get in the bin. You're out.
/S.
Straight to
Too
the
glib.
I
jail.
knew you would love that comment.
Okay, so let's like bring it back a little bit. So privacy laws around the world are often, yeah, as I said, principles based. It does mean, though, as you highlighted, James, that the bigger ones can kind of game the system a little bit. You can find loopholes and be like, oh, well, and I think Mimi, you sort of highlighted this before. We'd be like, oh, well, we got consent, so it's fine. I was like, that's not consent, guys. That's, you're being absolutely like just, taking the piss a little bit.
You have to click this button to keep using the thing you paid for.
Exactly.
You consented.
And that's one of the major
Exactly.
pitfalls of privacy law, is that it is sort of very much focused on this idea of like notice and consent and personal choice and autonomy. But often we don't actually have any sort of meaningful choices to be able to exercise that. So it's all kind of a bit of an illusion often. One of the things that I think is worth calling out here is that so privacy in Australia is one thing, and then GDPR is, as we mentioned a bit before, is this. It's often perceived as sort of like the gold standard. It's the big one. It's not perfect. There are flaws in it as well, but that's what people turn to a lot because they have done quite a lot of work at looking at it in a much more sort of comprehensive way. And then if we turn to the US, they're actually quite different in how they approach privacy law, in that rather than having like one thing that sort of says, here are the principles of how you should handle personal information, regardless of, what industry you're in. In the US, it's more like they've got separate laws for different sectors and industries, which is really unique. And I imagine probably really frustrating for privacy people in the US. But, maybe I'm making assumptions there.
Sam,
But
I have a question for you.
Yeah. Yes.
So we're talking about like privacy law, and we're talking about compliance and what people must do. But kind of flipping that back to privacy as kind of like a collective issue and as a form of harm reduction, like how does that all fit into it? Like, should we be thinking about privacy just so that we can get out of getting fined, or like, what's the purpose of it all?
I love that as a question because I would hate for us just to be protecting privacy just because we have to, because it's a compliance thing. I think that's if that's the only way that people are going to do it, then fine. Like that's
like if I told
I'll
you,
take it.
I have nothing to hide, so I personally don't care. Like, what would you say to me?
Oh, I would go on a rant. I
How
would
you
say
use
that
those words?
it's not just about you, Mimi. It's not just about you. That's what I would say.
The world doesn't revolve
because-
around me. Shocked and
because
appalled.
because privacy, we're all of our privacy and sorry, I'm mincing my words a little bit. Our privacy is all tied up together, right? So where a lot of the law and principles came from really sort of came from this very individualistic idea, this idea of like me and my information, my property rights, I should be like every man is an island or whatever, like I should be able to do my own thing, like a very libertarian idea of privacy. What it's happening now is it's shifting. This idea is shifting into more of a collective idea, the idea that, we are all in this together, and that privacy is a bit more of a networked thing. And so this kind of can happen in a few different ways. So, for example, my privacy is impacted by other people's choices. If somebody shares something like a picture of me, if somebody tags me in something, that will impact my privacy. The other issue is that as technology evolves and becomes more sophisticated, it's not as simple anymore as just, me filling out a form or, actively giving my personal information. It's also about all of that ubiquitous sort of behind the scenes data that's being collected and then being processed. And then when we look at things like machine learning, for example, being used in these ways to be able to make predictions or classifications on groups of people. So my information being plugged into these systems can then have an outcome on somebody else when that system is applied to them. Right. And so that, I think maybe I didn't explain that super well, but that idea of us being impacted by other people's information that's being collected is something that I don't think gets a lot of airtime. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just saying it's like a blast radius, right? Like I was trying to explain this to my mother-in-law, who has the age-old question, like, is my phone listening to me, like on the microphone? I'm like, it doesn't need to, my friend.
Yeah.
Because you're in a different country, you've come to this country, your phone's next to my phone, we're both sharing our location data, it now knows we're connected. So if you talk about jet skiing, now I'm getting ads for jet skiing. And it seems creepy, but like,
and it is.
That's really how it works. Like, it's not listening to you. There's so many other things that are going on.
Yeah.
I often think as well. Sorry, Sam.
Sorry, go. I was going to say. Oh, you go.
I was going to say, what's interesting is also like the vacuum of data creates a profile. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of discourse around how you not having any metadata is metadata, right?
Yeah.
Like, people talking about like, oh, I turn my location services off, I do all this sort of stuff, and it's like, well,
that's your profile now.
In a lot of the discourse that happens around metadata, like that's, you're hiding something almost, and that becomes part of your metadata. It's like I don't know if you've all watched Parks and Rec, but Ron Swanson burying his gold out in the forest doesn't actually remove him from the global banking system.
No.
It just creates a hole where his banking should have been.
Yeah, it reminds me of the that guy who got arrested for, I think it was calling in a bomb threat on his college because he wanted to get out of an exam, and he did it by creating a fake email account and like using Tor and sending it all through. But they caught him because he was the only person on the college network using Tor.
Mm-hmm. Oh my god!
Yep.
Yes,
Exactly.
That's amazing.
And
Perfect
then,
analogy.
So I think also what's important is if we zoom out a bit as well, is that invasions or loss of privacy on a societal level can have really big impacts on how we're able to participate in democracy, for example. If we think of like Cambridge Analytica as fundamentally a privacy issue, like that personal information, that data was not handled as it was, it was mishandled essentially. Then that shows that like when our privacy is threatened, democratic processes can falter. Even just thinking about surveillance more generally, like we know that pervasive surveillance does impact how people behave. It impacts how we participate, how we talk to each other. It, encourages us to conform. Like, if you think about any like progressive social movement, they needed some level of privacy to be able to organize, to be able to develop their thinking, to be able to, come together to then push for progression, for social progression. So I think that, that links us all together. Like, if we don't have privacy as a collective good, then we're in trouble, and that affects all of us, even if you aren't on Facebook.
Absolutely.
Sam, we've talked a lot about privacy.
I feel like a mic drop. Did anyone want to say anything about that?
I guess my question.
We're running out of time. I think that segues quite nicely into this idea of protecting privacy as harm reduction. There are lots of harms that can arise when privacy is not protected. I've listed a couple here, and I really want to challenge people to think about it more than just a data breach. Obviously, lots of awful things can happen when there is a data breach, identity theft, reputational issues, all kinds terrible things can happen when that happens. But there are other harms that can arise when people's personal information is collected and used and processed in ways that are not ethical or deceptive. And so I quite like to think about protecting privacy as a way that we can reduce the impact of these harms, the way that we can protect ourselves and other members of our community, and sort of, if you're feeling bold, society at large, from a lot of these quite big, awful outcomes. So that's what I mean when I say protecting privacy as harm reduction. Does anyone have any thoughts about that before we wrap up? I feel like we just skimmed the surface of all of these really meaty topics.
Beck was going to segue earlier, but I don't think you were able to hear.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask. I can't. Like, we've covered so much.
I can't hear anyone now.
Aha, that's what it was.
There we go.
Hey. Mystery solved.
Oh, I don't know what's going on.
Oh, so Sam can't hear us. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Well, we've been having a good conversation amongst ourselves anyway. So
Yeah.
Sorry, my headphones just stopped working, and I was like, "Why is nobody talking to me?"
Oh no!
Can you hear us now?
Can you?
My bad.
Can you hear us now? Nope. No. Doesn't sound like it. Oh no. We'll work it out. Technology. It's fun. Maybe this is how we get true privacy, right?
You just turn everything off? Yeah.
Yeah. Pour it into 2 feet of concrete and we'll be good.
Yeah. I despair that that's the conclusion we often come to with conversations like this. Is just throw it in a volcano and walk away. That's it.
Yeah.
So private.
That's all that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then in terms
Sam,
of like talking
hear us
about
now that you don't have headphones.
Oh, that looked like a face of joy.
I can hear you now.
Great. Okay.
Yay.
Wonderful.
You're like
so
these
devastated.
people. My God.
One of the questions that I was going to ask earlier is we've covered, why privacy law is important, how it affects us as a collective as well as individuals. What tips do you have for developers, engineers, and people wanting to sort of try and play a part in improving the situation that we currently have and making sure that, they design with privacy in mind?
Yeah, that's a great way to wrap this up, I think. So keeping in mind all of this discussion that we've had about how it is quite challenging and they are different things, privacy and security. I think coming back to that idea of keeping in mind the human impacts, like treating personal information that you're handling as something that does have an impact on people is a really, it sounds like a small thing, but I think that can make quite a big difference in how we think about the sort of the work that we're doing. privacy by design is a concept that's been around for a very long time about building privacy in from the beginning rather than tacking it on at the end. Very similarly to security, if you tack it on at the end, you're going to get into trouble and it's going to be expensive and it's going to just be a nightmare to sort of like backfill those sorts of protections. So keeping it in mind from the beginning is really important. I think, things like, it's tricky. If you have somebody in your team or in your organization that is tasked with privacy governance, working with them closely, I feel like they often get separated and don't talk to each other enough. So I think developing this culture of actually sitting down with the privacy people who may not have the level of technical expertise that the security team or security person, depending on the scale, has. And so I think that can often be a bit of a divide, but finding ways to be able to communicate with each other and work together, I think, is really fundamentally important. There's lots of growing work happening in spaces around how to, privacy engineering, how to document code, for example, so that and to annotate data so that like what should be protected in what ways and what sort of classification of data it is. Like those sorts of things are becoming more and more common. And so like digging into stuff like that, I think, and building it into your security practice as much as you can is a great all of those things are great steps. I think that any one of those steps would be an improvement. We're not perfect. We can't do everything, but keeping it in mind would go a long way.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I feel like we could talk about this for hours, and I'm checking the clock, and the clock is telling me our time is up. But there's so much more to discuss. So if you do want to continue the discussion, we can mosey on over to Discord. I know you were promised a cat. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry.
This cat is rumored to have been very rude on calls, and we've not been graced with her presence. So I feel like it's,
I love the discussion.
Oh,
So one
yes.
time the cat was like,
I love the
sweet
dedication.
baby. Hi.
So
Hi.
angry.
So angry.
She's like, why did you get me up?
Unhand me, woman.
Privacy is important.
I was trying to
The cat's privacy not.
Not considered. Okay.
She did not consent
so let's mosey on over to Discord if we want to keep chatting about this, because like there's so much more that we can unpack. But thank you so much, Sam, for joining us. It was really amazing to have you.
Thanks for having
me. There were so many thought-provoking and interesting things to talk about. So our next show will be with Rithi Coddy on Sunday, the 20th of March at 5 p.m. UTC. Check out our meetup.com page for all of the details on that. And as always, you can keep updated on Discord, Twitter, the drill. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks.
Bye.